The suitcase zipper snapped shut in Caleb's hands, sharp and final, and the sound made our Denver townhouse feel too quiet. He stood beside the bed with 2 suitcases and a leather duffel, dressed like a man leaving for a meeting instead of a marriage. "Don't make this a divorce. Marin," he said without looking at me, his voice already polished for the lie. "I'm leaving for a while, and I'm not signing anything." Outside, Lydia Trent waited in a cream rental car, sunglasses in her hair, checking her lipstick like she had earned my driveway. I did not ask who she was, because her LLC had been sitting in Caleb's vendor ledger for 3 weeks. First, it was a retainer. Then, consulting. Then hotel charges dressed up as client entertainment. "You think leaving with her is simpler than court?" I asked. Caleb turned halfway, irritation crossing his face, before he buried it under that patient voice he used on clients. "It is simpler," he answered. "You stay here. I move on. Nobody gets dragged through paperwork." The word paperwork nearly made me smile, because paper was exactly where he had left himself exposed. "Is that what Lydia told you to say? Or did you finally write your own lie?" I asked, and his hand tightened around the duffel strap. For 1 second, the room shifted, because he knew I knew her name, but not that I had bank statements waiting. "Don't start with this," he warned, stepping past me into the hall, while Lydia watched through the windshield like she owned the ending. "I'm not starting anything," I answered, following only far enough to watch him reach the front door. Caleb lifted his suitcase over the threshold and gave me the sentence he always used when he wanted me quiet. "You'll be fine. Marin. You always are." That sentence told me exactly what he thought I was. The woman who fixed payroll, cleaned books, covered gaps, and swallowed humiliation until it looked like grace. "Enjoy the next few days," I said. And when he asked what I meant, Lydia called his name, so he chose her impatience over my silence. He drove away believing he had left before consequences could catch him, while I went straight to my office and opened Benton Wexler's folder. "He left," I said, and Benton answered, "Then we file Monday," as I stared at the transfer marked Strategy Consulting, the one that paid for Lydia's Boulder suite. Caleb had not escaped the story. He had only left his signature everywhere. The first night without Caleb did not collapse around me, which almost felt more honest than grief could have managed. The townhouse stayed upright. The heat clicked on, and the hallway kept the same framed prints he had passed with luggage. I locked the front door and stood there listening, not for his return, but for the exact shape of what he left. My wedding ring still sat on my hand, and I did not remove it because some things lose meaning before they leave your body. In the kitchen, I poured water and caught my reflection in the dark window. Pale sweater, tired eyes, one hand still marked by marriage. Down the hall, Benton Wexler's folder waited with Caleb's transfers. Lydia Trent Creative, and dates that made excuses impossible. "Greer," Maddox called before I decided whether to sit down or keep moving, and her voice came through steady enough to trust. "Did he actually leave with her in the driveway?" she asked. While I looked toward the door, his suitcase wheels had crossed. "Yes," I answered, and the word sounded smaller than the mess behind it. So she let me breathe before giving one ordinary instruction. "Then eat something before you go to war with paperwork," Greer said, and I almost laughed because that was care I understood. I toasted 1 slice of sourdough and ate half of it standing at the counter. Not hungry, just obedient to survival. Strength did not look like a raised voice that night, but like dry bread, clean hands, and records waiting under a brass lamp. The next morning, Owen Price called from the studio before I finished coffee, and his tension arrived before his words did. A payment batch had locked, a vendor retainer duplicated, and the bank wanted principal verification. Caleb was not answering. Even gone. Caleb had left the business trained to call me when numbers stopped pretending. Document the error and don't resubmit anything, I told Owen, and the quiet after that instruction felt cleaner than fixing another mess. By afternoon, Benton filed the divorce petition, preservation request, and first notice tied to our shared business interests. Caleb texted before sunset, "Hope you're being reasonable." And I read it beside the ledger showing Lydia's retainer. I did not answer because reasonable had always meant quiet when Caleb needed something buried. His second message arrived colder. "Don't start something you can't control." So I forwarded it to Benton without touching the folder. Benton replied, "Save everything. Do not engage." And I placed the phone face down beside the bank statements. Caleb believed silence still belonged to him because it always had before. This silence had records, timestamps, and a filing number. That night, I slept badly, but I slept inside a house where nothing important was missing anymore. Caleb called at 7:48 Friday morning, before the coffee finished dripping, and his name on my phone looked less like a husband than a warning. I answered because Benton had told me not to hide from anything that could become evidence. He did not bother with hello, and his first words carried the thin panic of a man losing access. "What did you file?" "Marin?" he demanded, while somewhere behind him a door closed too hard. "I filed what was required," I answered, watching steam rise from my mug because my hands needed something ordinary nearby. He laughed once, sharp and empty, then told me the bank had frozen. The credit renewal and payroll was stuck in review. The Aspen Boutique Hotel had paused its lighting installation, and a vendor wanted confirmation before releasing fixtures already in transit. "Then explain the invoices," I said, and the silence after that sentence did more work than anger. Caleb tried the clean version first, calling it a system error, a duplicate retainer, a misunderstanding created by banking rules. I let him talk because every excuse circled the charges Benton had, indexed by date and account. Then Lydia's voice cut through the background, low but clear enough to land. "Why are they asking for my LLC statements?" Caleb covered the phone too late. And in that small mistake, she stopped being a shadow and became part of the record. When he came back, his voice had lost its polish, and I could hear him moving like the room had narrowed. "You dragged her into this," he snapped. But the transfer-marked strategy consulting had done that before I spoke her name. "You already did," I answered. "I'm just letting it become legible." He threatened to make it ugly if I did not call the bank, which told me he still thought pressure was control. By noon, Benton sent Caleb's attorney the settlement proposal, and the subject line looked mild enough to underestimate. I asked for the townhouse, my lawful business share, limited forensic accounting, and disclosure before any non-disparagement terms. Caleb called after reading it, breathing harder, saying I was cornering him and trying to destroy what we built. I told him he had two options: sign before the review widened, or explain every vendor line tied to Lydia Trent Creative. That afternoon, the Denver Design Council questioned his showcase sponsorship, and Owen forwarded the email because Caleb had stopped answering staff. The Aspen client moved from concern into formal pause, and the bank requested more documentation on discretionary charges. I did not celebrate it, because each email had a person or payroll cycle attached. When Caleb called once more and asked what signing would stop, I heard the first real crack. I stood beside the kitchen window, looking at the street where he had left with Lydia, and let the question sit. "It stops the damage from spreading," I said, "if the disclosure is complete." He did not argue right away, which told me more than any apology could have. The bank did not care about his charm, and Caleb's story had reached a place where only records could speak. Caleb came back without warning 3 days after the bank stopped believing his version of the business. The knock hit the front door hard, not violent, but too sharp to be courtesy. I opened it and found him where he had last stood with luggage, only now his shirt was wrinkled and his confidence looked borrowed. No cream rental car waited at the curb, and Lydia's absence told me almost as much as his face did. "We need to talk," he started, leaning forward like the old distance between us still belonged to him. I stayed in the doorway and let the threshold hold its place. "You shouldn't be here," I answered, and his mouth tightened like I had broken a rule he never wrote down. "We are past that, Marin," he said. But I did not move aside, because this was not his hallway anymore. His phone buzzed while he listed the damage. The paused Aspen contract. The credit review. The vendor asking for payment up front. Each item arrived faster than the last, as if speed could turn his consequences into my responsibility again. "Fix it," he said, and the word sat between us with all 15 years behind it. "No," I answered, and his eyes narrowed because one clean word gave him nothing to twist. "Don't give me that," he snapped, then softened before the anger could finish showing. "This is our business, Marin, not some courtroom fantasy." I watched his thumb hover over his phone, where Lydia's name flashed before he turned it face down too late. The preview stayed visible long enough for me to read. "Tell her not to drag my LLC into this." That small line did more than any confession, because Lydia feared my records more than my grief. Caleb saw my eyes move, and the careful softness slipped from his face. "She has nothing to do with this," he said, but the retainer payments had answered before he did. "You didn't leave me for love," I told him. "You left because you thought I was the cheapest part of your life to remove." His jaw worked once, and for the first time, he looked less offended than exposed. He reached for my wrist, not roughly, just automatically, using a gesture that once ended arguments before they became honest. My body remembered the old meaning before my mind stepped in, and that half second made me pull back cleanly. "Don't," I said, and he stared at my hand like it had betrayed him. 15 years. He tried, softer now, but the phone in his palm still carried Lydia's message. Benton called before Caleb could rebuild the silence, and I answered with the door still open. His voice came through calm, explaining that the bank had received the preservation notice and the forensic accountant would request vendor documents within 48 hours. Caleb heard enough, and the color moved out of his face in a slow, private way. "So that's what this is," he muttered, and I answered, "No, Caleb, this is what comes after." He told me his lawyer would respond, but the threat had lost its weight before he finished saying it. When he turned toward the porch, he did not look back at the rooms he once assumed I would keep warm for him. I closed the door after he left and rested my hand against the wood until my breathing evened. Nothing dramatic had happened, except the first real shift in power, and that was enough. The Denver Design Council preview took place inside a private gallery where trouble did not raise its voice. It shortened handshakes and emptied smiles. Caleb came in a tailored jacket, because men like him believe polish can outrun a bank review if people watch. Lydia walked beside him in a satin dress I recognized from a charge coded as client hospitality, smiling like the room belonged to her. I stood beneath gallery lights with my name printed on sponsor paperwork Caleb had hoped to claim without correction. Benton had told me not to let Caleb represent ownership alone, so I attended and kept my hands steady around a glass I never drank. Nobody shouted when I entered, but the room shorted in quiet, expensive ways that made Lydia's smile work harder with every introduction. A gallery owner touched my arm and murmured, "We'll wait until the review clears," then stepped away before Caleb could turn it into charm. The Aspen Hotel buyer avoided Lydia completely, and that avoidance mattered because his paused installation had started the week Caleb called temporary. Owen found me near the back wall, holding his phone like the screen had become heavier than any fixture invoice. "Caleb asked me to backdate a vendor memo," he said, keeping his voice low enough for dignity and truth. The email showed a retainer adjustment tied to Lydia Trent Creative, dated after the bank had already requested documents. I told him to send it to Benton tonight and not discuss it with Caleb again, because the timestamp had done enough talking. Owen nodded once, and that nod did more for the business than Caleb's whole room of practiced warmth. Lydia caught me near the coat room, still smiling, though her eyes had sharpened around the edges as people drifted closer without admitting it. "It's sad watching someone confuse paperwork with power," she said, letting the sentence land where strangers could hear. I looked at her dress, her bracelet, and the small gold bag hanging from her wrist before asking, "Which invoice paid for that one?" Her smile moved before the rest of her face could follow, and Caleb turned fast, but not fast enough to stop the silence around her. By morning, the design council removed Caleb from the showcase list pending review, and the email reached sponsors before lunch. Aspen moved from pause to termination for convenience, while a major vendor demanded payment up front before releasing fixtures. Lydia lost a client after the client's attorney asked whether her LLC might appear in discovery, and Caleb called that evening asking what signing would stop. I stood in my kitchen where his suitcase wheels still lived in my memory, and I did not answer quickly. Signing would not restore contracts, erase Lydia's account statements, or make Denver forget who walked into that gallery pretending to be clean. It limits the damage if disclosure is complete, I said, because Benton taught me not to promise what paper could not support. Caleb stayed quiet long enough for me to hear traffic behind him, and that was when I understood he believed the records. Caleb signed 3 days after the showcase collapsed, not because he understood regret, but because his accountant understood the records. The meeting happened in Benton Wexler's office, with Caleb's lawyer reading each term like the words had teeth. I kept my hands folded while Caleb accepted the townhouse transfer, the structured business payout, and personal responsibility for charges that never served the studio. When Benton slid the final page forward, Caleb looked at me once and murmured, "You really let it go this far." I looked at the signature line, then at the man who had once believed my silence was part of the furniture. "No," I answered quietly. "You did." The divorce finalized without spectacle, and the review did not send Lydia Trent to prison because this was civil damage, not courtroom fantasy. It did remove the thing she wanted most, because her LLC now carried disputed payments, attorney emails, and clients who stopped returning her calls. Caleb lost the Denver Design Council showcase, the Aspen contract, and enough trust that even small vendors asked for money before touching his projects. Owen Price joined my new studio 2 months later, after Caleb reduced staff and started chasing short consulting work. Greer Maddox brought flowers for the opening. Not a giant arrangement, just clean white stems in a low glass bowl beside my first signed contract. Benton stopped by for 10 minutes, glanced at my organized files, and said, "Clean records make quiet lives possible." That night, I locked the studio myself and realized peace did not arrive loudly, but it did arrive on time. 6 months later, I saw Caleb in a Denver coffee shop, bent over his phone like he was waiting for someone else to fix the day. I left before he noticed me, because winning did not require an audience anymore. At home, I placed my wedding ring inside a wooden box and closed the drawer without shaking. Thank you for staying with this story. And if Marin's quiet strength felt familiar, tell me where you're watching from and what moment stayed with you. I hope this leaves you with something softer than anger. The reminder that peace can arrive after the hardest truth becomes clear.